Today, I'm going to be summarizing a series of Michel Foucault's lectures compiled in his book, Power, called Truth and Juridical Forms. Since I'm going to be reading through Foucault's works in an attempt to better understand postmodernism, I thought I would include my audience in this journey as well, as much as I am able. The purpose of these lectures is mainly to critique Marx's notion of ideology, as well as to revise and reformulate the approach of analysis to capitalist power. We'll see in the end that Foucault views the development of power and systems of control, as well as what Marx derisively called ideology, as essential prerequisites to the control of workers by capitalism. The whole imperative of productivity that exists in modern society, he argues, is the result of what he calls panopticism. So let's start with the first lecture. Foucault, drawing from Nietzsche, argues that knowledge is not natural to man. Rather, man starts with instincts, and he is confronted with a world that has not yet become beautiful or known. The internal conflict between man's instincts, combined with the confrontation with the world, results in the invention of knowledge. Nietzsche points out that knowledge has no origin, no Ursprung. Rather, it is an invention, like a spark emitting from the clashing of two swords. Knowledge is thus not within instincts, even though knowledge emerges from instincts. The modern conception of knowledge, starting with Descartes and going up through Kant, was the belief that knowledge was a natural faculty to man, and that knowledge was enabled by a kind of unity. In Kant's view, knowledge is possible due to a commonality between subject and object. There is the subject, man, and the object, the world. Between these two poles is something that intervenes and makes the connection possible, or God. But Nietzsche, of course, declared the death of God. In a world in which the intermediary between man and the object is gone, then how is knowledge possible? Foucault analyzes, through Nietzsche, that knowledge is fundamentally violence done to the object. The object is seized, dominated, repelled, rejected, destroyed, held at a distance. Knowledge, thus, is fundamentally a power relationship. Foucault says, to understand knowledge, we must look not to philosophers, but to politicians. Then Foucault traces the development of inquiry. He starts before the era of the inquiry with Homer, who presents a contest between two men over a foul having been committed in a game, in which the outcome of the dispute is determined by the taking of an oath, which is also a test or challenge by the gods. If the foul was committed, then the man would be struck down by Zeus's lightning bolt. No actual human attempt to discern the truth of whether a foul was committed was taken. This is the era of the test. However, in the years following Homer, Greek society, on the back of the development of law, had invented the concept of inquiry, the discovery of truth. Foucault uses Sophocles' story of Oedipus as a parallel. In Oedipus, King Oedipus tries to solve a plague that is afflicting his city. The oracle tells him that the cause of the plague is that someone has been murdered. Throughout the play, Oedipus consults different people to try and solve the murder, but it is revealed piece by piece that Oedipus is the murderer. First, when the blind prophet accuses him of the murder of King Laius, and later, when information given by a slave confirms the oracle's prophecy that the killer would be the son of Laius, it is revealed that Oedipus's true father was Laius. That the knowledge of the gods and the knowledge of the slaves connected in the form of a sumbulon, the conjoining of two corresponding broken halves, relates to the development of the witness as an instrumental means of discovering truth in the inquiry. Foucault then contrasts the Greek concept of inquiry with Germanic law during the time of the Roman Empire, in which disputes were settled not with truth, but rather, as with the earlier example in Homer's time, with tests. These disputes were only between two people, and the notion of having a third, impartial judge to determine the outcome of a dispute was unheard of. These tests were war carried out by other means, a privatized and ritualized form of warfare. This would continue to be true in Europe up until about the 12th century. Sometimes wrongs were settled by actual duels. Sometimes they were settled by physical or religio-magical tests, and other times they would be settled by verbal games or through showcasing one's social capital by getting some number of people to vouch for one's innocence. At no point in this process is any attempt made to prove the veracity of the wrong committed, but rather every test is simply a measurement of strength, prestige, or wealth. From the 11th to the 12th century, these tests would become gradually replaced by the inquiry. The development of inquiry was informed not only by church spiritual custom, but also by a political need for the state to acquire more managerial control over wealth and the circulation of goods in the form of reparations. The medieval rediscovery of inquiry was in the church and its practice of inquisitio, through which it exercised power over its domain. The inquisitor would approach authorities and knowledge and power in order to discover whether a transgression had taken place, and through this process of questioning, inquisitors would discover the truth and eventually establish who the guilty party was. In the Carolingian Empire, and eventually in England, a judicial system would develop off the back of the Inquisitio, bringing with it several new developments. In the first place, we have the birth of the figure of the prosecutor, who represented the sovereign in matters of law. No longer was a dispute between two parties, one accusing the other. Instead, the victim of the wrong was represented by the authority, strength, and status of the state. Second, we have the development of the infraction, which brought along a moral development in the treatment of wrongs. Instead of a simple injury from one party to another, a wrong was now construed as a violation of state authority as well as morality. So now, just as was the case in the church's inquisitio, a wrong was bundled up together with the notion of sin or immorality. The involvement of the prosecutor, and thus of the state's authority, is based on the logic that not just the victim was wronged by an act, but also the state. So when a person was found guilty, he had to pay restitution not just to his victim, but also to the state. This greatly increased the authority of the king to control his subjects, as well as their economic relations. Third, we also see the appearance of the witness. The witness signifies that the purpose of judicial proceedings began to be the search for truth, the making present of acts that had occurred in the past. Authorities, valued for their knowledge, were sought for consultation during proceedings. So rather than the outcome of a dispute being entirely contingent on a contest of power or strength, the outcome was instead reliant on the establishment of truth. The movement from test to inquiry affected not just the political, but also knowledge as a whole. Foucault offers the example of the transition from alchemy to chemistry. In alchemy, the operation is considered a test of both the operator and of nature, a test that the operator could win or lose. Knowledge was won through power, and it was transmitted through authority and elite secrecy, just as the method of resolving disputes in feudal Europe was a display of authority rather than of righteous truth. In chemistry, however, rather than being an operator who directly involves himself in the outcome of events, the experimenter is merely a witness to a process of nature. His purpose is to inquire as to the properties of chemicals and their reactions so as to form a body of knowledge through the act of witnessing. The body of knowledge is then recorded and transmitted in accessible texts that once again prove to others the veracity of what was witnessed. This knowledge is then tested by others to prove the truth of the experiments. So unlike alchemy, rather than knowledge being won with the authority of the operator, in chemistry, knowledge is what bestows that authority. The notion of the inquiry erupted into the development of scientific fields such as geology, botany, biology, and all the various scientific fields we're familiar with today. Foucault also notes that it even had the effect of informing the voyage as a quest for discovery. In his next lecture, Foucault explains the growth of the penal system as well as the establishment of the police. In the Middle Ages, as stated before, infraction was seen as a moral, spiritual, and legal transgression all at the same time. Thus, the way medieval societies treated those infractions tended to be very corporal and severe. In England, there were over 514 crimes that would send someone to the gallows. However, starting in the 18th century, there were sweeping reforms of the justice system, particularly in England and France, that would reduce the number of capital crimes and put an end to the corporal style of punishment. What became prevalent were penal theories of infraction, foundational on the development of the crime. Crime is a wrong against not just a victim and not just against the state, but rather against society as a whole. A person who commits a crime becomes a social enemy, and thus penal theory supposed that a number of punishments were just for a social enemy. The first one was deportation or exile. The second was forced labor. The third was retaliation. The fourth was humiliation, as well as a couple of others. The whole purpose of these theories was to, in some way, correct the wrong that had occurred against society and to allow the person who committed the wrong to pay their debt to society. However, these theories of punishment would be overcome by a new idea, namely individual rehabilitation and correction. Thus was born the penalty of imprisonment. That's not all, however. The old juridical process of inquiry would give way in the 19th century to the examination, as well as the concept of dangerousness. The purpose of justice was no longer simply the punishment of concrete and provable acts, but rather it had now become the management and control of an individual's likelihood to commit those acts, and then later it would be the punishment of an individual who deviates from the norm. This would be the final evolution of penal theory, which had gone from the infraction as a wrong against society to the crime, deviation from norms. Punishment became synonymous with correction. This then brings us to Foucault's famous theory of panopticism. The panopticon is a central structure in the center of a prison cell block from which an observer can observe others without himself being observed. Since he cannot be observed, it is impossible to know whether one is being watched at any given point in time, and thus, one must assume at all times that one is being watched and behave accordingly. Foucault argues that the process of continual examination by authority is a task delegated to police, psychiatrists, teachers, foremen, managers, and so on, is the implementation of the principle of the panopticon into wider, everyday society, not just the prison. Modern society, thus, is a society based on the panopticon, on control, surveillance, and correction of individual behavior. Foucault then traces the history of social control. He starts with the Quakers and Methodists who established societies for the correction of manners. This was intended to be an internal, bottom-up regulation of the behavior of people inside these religious groups. Only in this case, it was not meant necessarily to be a system of social control, but rather it was intended to serve as a preventative against the state finding excuses to exercise its much more brutal authority against those communities by forcing its members to keep a low behavioral profile. Eventually, though, these almost popular systems of self-regulation became adopted by society's broader social elite, who established their own manners societies under the idea that even if elites did not typically abide by social laws, they serve as role models to the underclass for whom these laws were actually made, and so in conforming to these laws, the upper class were enforcing the conformity of the lower classes to these laws as well. In this way, what was developed as a communal defense became a system of top-down social control. Then Foucault switches to France, where they had a system called letters de cachet, which were essentially petitions for the king to take some kind of action. Typically, these letters were used from the bottom up to request punishments for someone in a community, such as a disliked parishioner, a notorious person, or simply an inconvenient or disliked family member. Persons would write a letter de cachet, send it to the king's representative, who would then decide whether to grant it. If granted, typically it would call for the imprisonment of a person until their behavior was corrected. Foucault then goes through the development of police. He notes that the origin of police was in the transition of Europe into capitalism, particularly in England, where wealth was no longer exclusively tied up in land, but now tied up in goods and instruments of production as capital. Now that workers were in close proximity to the nation's wealth, the wealthy found a new need to guard their goods from the underclass and from thieves, for which they began hiring private security personnel. This practice was eventually co-opted by the state, forming the first police force. A similar process unfolded also in France, where urbanization put an end to the lifestyle of certain thieving peasants. In each of these examples, the Methodists and Quakers, the letters de cachet, and the police, we can see that power which originally started as self-regulation ends up evolving into state authority. In his final lecture, Foucault expands on panopticism. He gives the example of an 1840s French prison factory for women, in which women would sign on to work for a yearly lump sum and then be confined to the grounds of the factory until their term was up. Their whole lives would be strictly regimented, controlled, and supervised. For example, they had to get up at 5, begin work at 6, take an hour lunch break, finish work at 8, and be in bed by 9. Foucault then gets at the whole purpose behind the panopticon. The panopticon is fundamentally a means of appropriating man's time in order to convert it into labor time. But what's more is that all the various institutions invented in the modern West, such as prisons, schools, asylums, and hospitals, have developed an intense control of the person's body and their existence in general. Foucault argues that the purpose of taking control of the body and of taking control over a person's existence is to mold one's body to become fit for labor power. In order to be useful as labor time, a person first must be capable of labor power. And moreover, he notes that these institutions always have the function of attaching a person to something, whether that be a body of knowledge as in a school or a body of persons such as in a prison. These are not exclusionary institutions, though they may be institutions of confinement. Then Foucault defines a couple of terms, hyperprofit and infrapower. The panopticon as a system of state control is certainly quite impressive, but what Foucault is more interested in is in all of the little kinds of authority that, from the bottom up, are used against us in our daily lives. He gives the example of the use of epistemic authority, or the extraction of knowledge from the confined. Teachers learn how to better control their students by learning from and adapting to the way students interact with their materials and exercises. Managers better learn how to control workers by stealing their micro-innovations and then making them compulsory for all workers so as to increase production. This is part of what Foucault calls infrapower, the involvement of little networks of control and surveillance to control people's actions and appropriate their time. Hyperprofit is the production of large amounts of surplus value, and Foucault argues that there is no hyperprofit without infrapower. We then end with Foucault's argument against the Marxist notion of ideology. Marx believed that ideology was an ex-post-facto justification that capitalists make to justify their class interest. Marxists also maintain that labor relations are the only relevant thing to capitalist authority. But Foucault rather argues that ideology is essential to capitalist power. The whole purpose of explaining the development of power, knowledge, and control was to reveal how these systems must come together to create an attachment of humans to labor in the first place, knocking over Marx's conclusion that labor is the essence of man. Institutions, on the other hand, must create that attachment of men to labor for capitalists to have any power in the first place.